Okay, well, I have 8:02 on my clock here, so I'm going to get going, and if others join us later on, that would be fine. I want to say thank you to Betsy and others for inviting me to come into your homes or your offices, wherever you might be this evening, and sharing with you a little perspective about my journey in autism and tell you a little bit more about my family and our experiences with autism, but also share with you some perspective on autism over the lifespan, as well as share with you some of the things that we're doing at Autism Speaks, which is a large national advocacy organization based here in the United States. And I'll tell you a little bit more about our history and what we're currently doing to help families deal with autism and helping us hopefully one day find a cure for autism. So the title of my talk is a closer look at autism, and I've kind of learned over the years that the best way to share my experiences about autism is to tell you a little bit about my own journey and where it started and what our experience has been. I apologize, the way that this is set up, I don't have the opportunity to do animation, and so when I show you a slide, it pretty much reveals the whole thing as opposed to building up, which I normally do when I do some of these PowerPoint presentations. But let me just really start with a little bit of background about myself. I'm married to a wonderful woman by the name of Liz, who I married almost 20 years ago. We'll be celebrating our 20th anniversary this year, and we have three wonderful children. Our oldest, Tyler, who is just about actually to turn 16. He turns 16 a week from today, is our oldest, and Tyler is our child that has autism. He has a younger brother, Derek, who's 14 and a half, about 18 months younger than Tyler. And we also have a young girl, Avery, who's 10 years old. And professionally, when I graduated from business school in 1992, I joined a division of Johnson & Johnson, which I think most people know is a very large healthcare company here in the United States. And I spent 12 years there as a marketing executive. In 2004, I left that position and I joined Cure Autism Now, which is, or was actually a very large national-based organization that was started in 1995 by John Chestak and Portia Iverson out in Los Angeles. And I left J&J to become the president and CEO of that organization, and I did that for 3 years. And then in 2007, CAN merged with Autism Speaks, and I decided to stay on, and I currently am the Executive Vice President for Program and Services. And I'll go a little bit more into detail about that later, but what that means is I am responsible for our family services, government relations, and our autism treatment. And we had a really wonderful and positive experience. Tyler participated in many of the activities. We got to know the leadership there quite well, and in fact, one of Tyler's weekend companions, a gentleman by the name of Jason Flente, is now the program manager for that program out in the South Bay, which is part of the Los Angeles area. So we have some really wonderful memories of having participated in Friendship Circle. I've also had the opportunity to address, I guess, the national convention just last summer. So I think that's probably why I was invited to come and share with you some of my experiences around autism. So our journey with autism really started about 13 years ago, come this February. It was right after my son Tyler's 3rd birthday that we took him to Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and he was diagnosed with autism. Let me tell you a little bit about Tyler's development. These are 3 pictures during his 2nd year of life, so from the time that he was 12 months through almost 2 years at 22 months. And the reason I show these pictures is that I think if most people were to look at these, they would see a very cute child, one who is very happy, very engaged, and also seemingly quite healthy and developing normally. Tyler had what many would term regressive autism. He seemed to be completely fine. He seemed to be completely fine for the first 2 years of his life. However, when we go back and look at some of these pictures, there's a couple things that I just want to note. The one on the left, when he was 12 months, he's holding a bottle of, in this case, it was cow's milk. And we noticed that when we introduced cow's milk, and you know, our pediatrician said you really shouldn't do that until you're 12 months. We did notice the fact that he started to develop ear infections and other kinds of infections, and just, you know, becoming, I guess, a less healthy child. And you know, it just was something that we noticed. At 18 months, the picture here does show that, at least in my estimation, he has quite a large head. And that's actually become one of the more common findings that they've developed over the last 5 to 10 years, and that is there seems to be an acceleration in the growth of the brain of many children that have autism. And so while we couldn't see it in terms of the symptoms, so to speak, or his behaviors and what have you, it's interesting to note that if you look at this picture, he does seem to have a fairly large head. And the picture on the right, when he's 22 months, you'll see that he's holding 2 fish paddles. And the reason I selected this photograph is that we did start to notice as he was getting towards 2 years old that he had a lot of repetitive and certain things that he needed to have in his hands. He actually had a plastic hammer, which was another thing that he just had to carry around with him all over the place. And in this case, he was playing with these paddles, and he just seemed to not want to give them up. These are all, you know, kind of what I'll call subtle signs that if we go back and kind of retrace that second year of life, you know, there seem to be some things that we probably, you know, should have noticed, or with more information we could have noticed. Tyler really did seem to regress, however, during his 3rd year. When he was at his 2nd year well check, we did mention to the pediatrician that he seemed to have less language than his peers. He had language. He had about 250 words. He was starting to put them together, but he just didn't seem to be quite at the level as most of his peers. And again, we were told by our pediatrician, you know, that's fine. He's a boy. He has a new brother in the house. I wouldn't worry about it. And in fact, he called him a developmental star based on his evaluation of him at that time. The reason I chose these photographs is that I think it does also depict a regression and kind of something that really went awry in his play skills. At 20 months, these are obviously Duplos. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. And as you can see in the first picture in the upper left-hand corner, when he was 20 months, he had a very, really what was considered to be a sophisticated play scheme. He used a lot of different colors. He had animals and cars and trains, and he was really engaged and really had some wonderful play skills and imagination, and he was very willing and able to share that with others. And so his joint attention was very strong, and this really does show that he had some great play skills. But as he started to become about 2 years old and he got a little bit older, as you can see, the villages went away, and he started to just build towers. And the towers at 24 months were multiple colors. At 26 months, they started to be the same color, and by 28 months, he would only use one color. And so I look back at these photographs, and I think it's a interesting depiction of how his play skills really did regress during that 3rd year of life. And obviously, there were a number of other things, and part of that was losing language and really developing some behaviors that were very considered to be very odd and not typical of your 2 or 3 year old child. So we finally did get a diagnosis in February of 1996. Tyler was just a little bit over 3 years old. This occurred at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. His official diagnosis at that time was something called PDD-NOS, or pervasive developmental disorder, not otherwise specified. Of course, we really didn't know what that meant, and our pediatrician that diagnosed Tyler attempted to tell us a little bit more about what PDD-NOS was. But quite frankly, you know, there were a couple things that she said to us that were very discouraging, or you know, really caused, I think, some unnecessary delay in our ability to accept the diagnosis. Some of the things that she did share with us is that we caught it early, which is somewhat interesting because today a lot of children are able to be diagnosed in the first or really actually the 2nd year of life, so about 12 to 14 months in some cases. although the ones that are regressive are not typically caught up or diagnosed until later. We were also told that his emotional attachment to us was a plus, and that to this day I think is still one of Tyler's greatest strengths. We were actually interestingly told that this isn't autism, that when we showed some sensitivity or the fact that we were somewhat upset about the diagnosis, I think she felt like she was comforting us by saying this isn't classic autism, this isn't autism, but of course we know that PDD-NOS is part of the autism spectrum. We were also told that we should consider some intensive behavioral programs and speech and OT, but there was nothing very specific, and that we were really left to kind of go out and figure it out ourselves. And ironically, she also said, soon you will both have PhDs in autism, and I think probably to this day she's always maybe regretted the fact that she forecasted what we would end up doing. At any rate, our journey went from there, and during what I'll call the early intervention years, where the focus really is put onto what are the behavioral and biomedical and educational things that you need to do for your child. And I include all three of those because they're all critically important. It's very important to get your child into an intensive behavioral program. That's probably the first thing I always tell families when they get a diagnosis, because it sometimes takes the longest to get it put into place and get all the proper funding in place and so forth. But certainly the biomedical is important as well, because a lot of these kids with autism are very sick, and they have a lot of biomedical issues that need to be addressed, and there are a number of avenues that you can go there. And then also you have to focus on the educational and making sure that they get a good educational program so that they can eventually transition into school. The next part of our journey was that transition into school. For us, it was a pretty rocky road for the first couple of years. We lived in a school district in Pennsylvania that unfortunately was probably more focused on getting their children into really good colleges, and they didn't pay as much attention to the special education children. And so we struggled for those first 2 years, and many of you I know are very aware of IEPs, and at least in our case we ended up in due process, and but it was also a time where we became greater advocates for our son Tyler, as well as just being advocates in general for autism. And it really took about 2 or 3 years for us to get our feet under us and get used to the fact that this was going to be a long haul for us. And but we eventually said that this was important, and we became very strong advocates for autism in general. Eventually, adolescence hit us, and this hit us about 3 years ago. And what occurs during this time are a lot of the social emotional types of things. There's no question that Tyler is very much aware of his world and his surroundings and what others think and so forth, and so it's important that you address that. Eventually every child does go through puberty, and it can be difficult, and certainly have some war stories there. We also experienced a number of comorbidities during this time. Tyler, unfortunately, about 2 years ago, went through a fairly significant second regression. This involved something called catatonia, which is really more or less a psychiatric diagnosis for the stiffening and becoming very rigid and losing a lot of motor skills. But we were blessed with the fact that we were able to identify biologically what was happening to him, and we were able to treat it, and fortunately that has, for the most part, gone away completely. And so I never thought I'd be able to say that I'm really thrilled to have my son with autism back, but in this case that's what happened with Tyler. And then certainly we're going to be looking in the future years to his transition to adulthood. And this is perhaps one of the most important things that I think our autism community is going to face in the next 5 to 10 years, because we have what many people term as a tsunami of children who will eventually become adults. And if you look at the prevalence statistics, they certainly indicate that the vast majority of people that have autism today are under the age of 21. But eventually those children are going to become adults, and we have a lot of issues, including housing and employment and community integration, that we're going to have to address. So this is an area that we at Autism Speaks are going to put a lot more focus on going into the future. but it's something that certainly we as a family are going to be facing, and we've already begun our transition into that part of the journey. But the common theme that we've always had around Tyler's journey is that at all times we've had unconditional love and hope. Hope that one day he will be able to live perhaps without his autism, that we would be able or will be able to improve the quality of his life. And that's one of the reasons why we are such staunch advocates and wanting to create a different world for him in the future, and something that has been a consistent theme throughout our lives in our journey through autism. This will just give you a quick shot of Tyler today. This is Tyler and myself on the first day of school in September of last year. And as you can see, he's a nice, handsome young man, and he's doing quite well today. I share this next slide because I think it's important to give some perspective. I presented this for the first time about 3 or 4 years ago when I was presenting at the Brookings Institution. And it really looks at the history of autism, and I look at it in 3 different phases. It was first characterized, as many of you know, in 1943 by a psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins University. Leo Kanner is his name. And for the first 20 or 25 years, there was this age of denial where, unfortunately, people almost denied its existence, and that it was largely seen as something that was due to bad parenting. And in fact, there was a dreadful term that was created called the refrigerator mother. Eventually that did go away, and that was done in really the 1960s. And most of that work was done by Bernard Rimland, who was a PhD scientist in Southern California, who has a son, Mark. That's probably in his early 40s, but Bernie Rimland really was responsible for helping us get rid of this notion of autism being caused by bad parenting and getting the medical community to accept it as a biological disorder. But in the 1960s and into the 70s, we had this age of defeat, and that was, even though they accepted it as a biological disorder, most people thought of it as something that really couldn't be improved with any degree of attention. That once you had autism, you always had autism, and that the prognosis for a child that was diagnosed with autism was pretty bad. And some of that did filter into the 90s, but we now live in what I consider to be the age of hope. And that is an age where we do believe that autism can be treated, that autism doesn't necessarily indicate that it's going to be a lifelong disorder. Many children do quite well from some of the interventions. Unfortunately, we don't know which ones are going to respond the way that they do. But we do live in an age of hope. And even those children who maintain the diagnosis into adulthood, many of them are going on and doing phenomenal things. And I think we've certainly seen a lot of examples in the media over the last several years. So fortunately, we do live in an age of hope. I believe that we're soon entering what I'll call the age of belief. And the age of belief is when we'll be able to say that we understand autism, that we can prevent it, that we can treat it, and ultimately, hopefully, we can cure it for some individuals as well. So if I look at autism from the time when Tyler was diagnosed in 1990, actually he was diagnosed in 1996, and compare it to today, looking back 12, 13 years ago, it was considered to be a very rare disorder. In fact, the prevalence was 1 in 2,500. Most people thought of it as being poorly understood. It was not treatable. It was considered to be a lifelong disability. There really wasn't much you can do, and unfortunately the NIH, National Institute of Health, was spending just a meager $5 million a year to understand this disorder better. Today, many people term it as an epidemic. The prevalence statistics for the last 2 years has been about 1 in every 150 children. That's a national statistic. Here in New Jersey, where I reside, the figure is closer to 1 in 100 or 1 in 96. It is considered to be better understood, but we still, our understanding of the order is not where it needs to be. I think it's more commonly considered to be treatable, fortunately. There are stories and cases of recovery, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. We also understand the benefits of early intervention, and this is, I think, probably one of the most significant discoveries that we've made in the last 5 or 10 years, is that children who are diagnosed as early as possible are the ones that tend to have the best outcomes. And that's a very important thing for us to keep in mind. The current budget at the NIH is roughly about $127 million. I use an asterisk there because that's a statistic that they quote. However, when we look more deeply at that information, they're really only spending closer to $80 million on what I would call autism direct or specific research. A lot of the research that they throw into that figure is brain research or research that affects brain systems that might be involved with autism. So it's a definition kind of thing. And then of the $80 million, only about half of it is new research. So the other half is from funding studies that were done in previous years. So there is a lot more research that's going on, and we work very hard to make sure that every dollar that is spent is done on research that we believe is relevant and will make a difference for our community. What has changed in the last 10 or 15 years and has kind of allowed autism to enter this new era is that by and large, parents refuse to accept the status quo. There were a number of organizations that were started in the middle 1990s. Cure Autism Now was one of them. The National Alliance for Autism Research, which is was based here in Princeton, New Jersey, was another. And then the Defeat Autism Now network was also founded around the same time. And really, these three groups are the ones that helped put autism on the map and created what I consider to be a very well-funded and well-developed research community. We've lobbied for more government spending, so the reason that the NIH is spending $127 million versus $5 million like it was before is because we've been able to get bills passed that have forced the government to spend more money on autism research. The first one that made that happen was the Children's Health Act of 2000, which President Clinton signed into law in the year 2000. And then about 6 years later, the Combating Autism Act was passed. And this is a piece of legislation that provides about $1 billion worth of authorizations for research spending that will occur over the next 5 years. And this also gave families hope. Autism is ubiquitous these days. You see it everywhere. The media coverage is certainly very strong. And fortunately, the stigma is fading, and as a result, autism is no longer really in the closet anymore. I'm going to have to, I believe, change slides, so bear with me for a second. There we go. Worked well. So autism today, we have a rising rate of autism, 1 in 150, as I mentioned, 1 in 94 boys. We know that autism affects boys 4 times more often than girls. Interestingly, there was a study that came out just this past week from California, which indicated that the rise in autism was not due purely to increasing diagnostic factors or the methods in which we're counting autism. So that was a very interesting study that came out. 80% of the population, and these are based on statistics in California, 80% of the population is under the age of 21. And so as we start thinking about adults in the future, this is going to be a very important thing. There's been huge awareness gains. Specifically, Autism Speaks has done a Learn the Signs campaign with the Ad Council, and this has generated about $150 million over the last 3 years of free advertising to help create more awareness for autism. We now are one of 3 diseases that the UN recognizes with a Autism Awareness Day. That day is April 2nd, which is during Autism Awareness Month, and that will occur into perpetuity or until we are able to say that we have figured out autism and it no longer exists. Autism spending increases has gone on quite a bit, and the research dollars, as I mentioned before, in total, if you look at both private and public spending, is about $150 to $200 million. The total cost of autism is about $35 billion a year, and that's based off of a study that was done at the Harvard University School of Public Health. There have been more public and private partnerships, which have certainly contributed to some of the significant progress that we've made in the last 5 or 10 years. And we're just now starting to address some of the lifespan issues, and these are starting to emerge even more as we know that this population is aging. So I'm going to shift gears here a little bit and talk a little bit more about Autism Speaks, and then after that I will conclude and open it up for some questions. Autism Speaks is actually a relatively young organization, and it's only been around for not quite 4 years. It was founded in 2005 by a very influential couple, Bob and Suzanne Wright, who are the grandparents of a child, Christian, who is now 7 years old. And they decided that they wanted to make a big difference for their son, or their grandson in this case. And so in order to do that, they created their own organization and then went out and brought other leading national organizations together, specifically the Autism Coalition for Research and Education, Cure Autism Now, and NAR, all under one roof so that we could be one strong voice for this community. Our mission is really threefold. First, we really believe in changing the future for those who do struggle with autism. But we do that through funding global biomedical research that will look into the causes, prevention, and treatments, as well as a cure for autism. We want to raise public awareness about autism and its effect on families and those who are affected directly. And we also believe in bringing hope to all who deal with the hardships of this disorder. In total, we spent last year about $35 million on just the scientific research alone. But our mission really has 4 elements. We have a science element, we have family services, advocacy, and then also awareness. So for those of you who are visual like me, this will perhaps be helpful. But if you look at each one in very succinct terms, or a translation would be, the science is all about finding a cure. Family services is about making life better for those that are affected by autism today. Advocacy is really about changing the future and how the government's going to address and help us make it a better world for those that are affected. And then awareness is to make sure that we don't forget about our children and those that are affected by autism. I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of these areas, and then we should be good, and we'll go into some questions. On the science side of things, we're very dedicated to research. We have 2 different types of research mechanisms. One is to fund investigator-initiated grants. These are grants that get submitted to us by researchers around the world. And then we fund those that we consider to be the best science and that will make the biggest difference in our understanding of autism. We also fund very important initiatives and conferences. These are things that have more or less become our own idea, and we have very targeted research. And so because we've been doing this for some time now, we have a much better sense of the kind of research that needs to be done. And so we have a number of different initiatives that we have created ourselves and gone out and identified ways in which we can make those happen. We do have clinical programs which are very important to our science efforts. We have research resources which are really making it easier for researchers to do their work. One example would be the Autism Genetic Research Exchange, which is the world's largest database of what we call multiplex families that have autism, and these are families that have more than one child with autism. Another research resource that we have would be the Autism Tissue Program, which is a brain bank of brains that are available to researchers to study so that they can understand the underlying pathology of autism. We also have a number of treatment networks. We have one called the Autism Treatment Network, as I mentioned before, which is a consortium of 15 hospitals across the country. We actually have one in Canada as well that is helping us define what are considered to be best practice standards in terms of how autism gets treated. We also have a clinical trials network that is looking at specific medications and allow us to study those in a very quick and efficient way. Bioinformatics is a fancy term for helping us understand the information that we collect about families and those that are affected by autism. We've collected so much information that it's very important that we have a very efficient way of understanding and how to look at that data so that we can understand our population better, and it also drives very specific kinds of research going forward. And as I said before, we've spent upwards of around $36 million in terms of science at Autism Speaks over the last year or two. I included this slide just to share with you some of the more exciting developments. We are going to be issuing our top 10 events for 2008 in probably about the next 2 or 3 weeks. And some of these do come from that, but they give you a little bit of a flavor of some of the more interesting things that have been discovered in the last year or so. We're getting much closer to understanding what some potential biomarkers are for earlier diagnosis, and these would be ways in which we can identify autism even before behavioral types of things become a concern. So after a child is born, and there are certain ways in which we could, if we start having concerns or what have you, we might be able to identify those that are more susceptible to developing the disorder. And then, as a result, start applying earlier interventions, which can hopefully prevent them from developing the full-blown version of autism. So that's a very exciting development. There is converging evidence that autism is considered to be a synaptic disorder, and the synapse is basically the region between neurons in the brain. And there's a number of different discoveries that have been made in the last 2 to 3 years that are really pointing to this area of the brain that seems to be a lot of the focus, and some of the genetic as well as the environmental findings are starting to point in that direction. One of the big events in 2008 was the discovery of actually a child that had a mitochondrial disorder that developed autism as a result of having vaccinations in addition to that mitochondrial disorder. So the mitochondrial portion of the cell is actually getting a lot of attention these days and is considered to be a possible factor in causality for autism. We've also seen a recent report on the fact that recovery is real and can potentially be predicted. This is, I think, a very important finding because for many years a lot of people thought that that's something that's important to keep in mind. There have been a number of discoveries in terms of autism susceptibility genes, which is very important because there's been a lot of work in the last 5 or 10 years in trying to understand the genetics of autism better, and we're starting to finally be able to identify some of the genes that seem to be responsible for the development of autism. And probably one of the most exciting discoveries in the last year is that there's been an unexpected reversal of neurodevelopmental disorders. These aren't necessarily things that are autism per se, but they're things like Fragile X or tuberous sclerosis or Rett syndrome that often have a comorbidity with autism. And in animal models, they've been able to actually reverse the symptoms of those neurodevelopmental disorders with certain drugs and ways to manipulate the genes there. So that does suggest that if we are able to understand autism better, we may be able to reverse autism even in children as they get older and become adolescents or even adults. And that's a tremendously exciting finding, and I think most scientists didn't believe it would be possible just 5 years ago. The last two, the poor healthcare experience and family impact, has been something that's now documented. I think a lot of families have known this for some time, but there's now good documentation that shows that the healthcare experience that families get with autism is not what it should be, and certainly not the same as the general population, and that it has a significant impact on families. And then also there's been some clinical trials for some biological pharmaceuticals that are underway, and again, that's I think very encouraging for us in general. Our Family Services Department is relatively new at Autism Speaks. It's only been around for less than 2 years. We provide a number of resources for families, including an online resource guide, which is basically on our website and now has over 25,000 entries of services that are available to families. We launched our 100-day kit in April of last year and followed it up about 6 months later with a Spanish version of that. And we have now sent out over 12,000 of these kits, and we obviously are, a lot of people are accessing it through our website, but it's something that can certainly help families when they get a diagnosis of autism. Our website also has a resource library where you can find out information about books and DVDs and all sorts of things that are available to the autism community. And then in the fall, we introduced our School Community Toolkit, which is really meant to help schools become better equipped at involving our children into their school communities. And we've gotten some really wonderful feedback on the success of that, and a number of different schools that have used it in a very positive way. We also provide support to the community in the following forms. We have a community grant program. We have funded over $1 million worth of community grants to service providers across the country. We've done 3 rounds of that in the last 12 or 13 months. We have a families participate in research program so that if families do want to get involved in research, we can match them up with researchers around the country. And then we also have a federal legal appeal project where we have attorneys who on a pro bono basis do help families on certain cases, particularly those that have reached a federal legal appeal level. And again, information on all of these things is available on our website. As I have alluded to many times before, what we're going to do with adults in the future is critical. And we have a new program that we're involved in 2009 called the Advancing Futures for Adults with Autism. And this is a program that we're working with a number of other autism organizations to really help redefine the future for the adults and what they're going to experience in the future as it pertains to housing and employment and community integration. In fact, we have a think tank that's going to be held in the next couple of weeks. That will be the first phase of this, and then hopefully phase 2, which will be a national town hall meeting, will be held later this year so that we can truly have a better sense of what the needs are and be able to move that forward. And then in terms of our advocacy and government relations, we have a number of different things that have occurred there. I talked about the Combating Autism Act before, but at a federal level, we have a number of other pieces of legislation that we're working on. The Expanding the Promise of Individuals with Autism Act was a legislation that was introduced just under 2 years ago by Senator Clinton and Allard from Colorado. And unfortunately, that never did become a law, but we're going to be re-engaging on this in the future. There is a new piece of legislation that's in the works called the Autism Treatment Acceleration Act, or ATA, I suspect you'll be hearing more about that in the future. The Department of Defense has a very important research program on autism, and this has been going on for about 2 or 3 years now and has funded over $15 million worth of autism research. However, at a state level, and this is where we have been probably most active in the last year or so, is this need to reform autism insurance. We know that our families have been discriminated against for many years, that insurance companies have really not been terribly responsive to the medical needs, and our children really do respond well, and they have a lot of medical issues, and there are interventions out there that can have a profound impact on their health and well-being. And so we have been very aggressive in going after insurance mandates. In fact, there are now 9 states in the country that have specific mandates that require insurance companies to cover autism. We have to not only work at this on a state level, but we also have to start working on it at a federal level. And so we're going to be hopefully getting a federal mandate maybe later this year, and that's something that we're working on very significantly. We've also spent a lot of time educating the presidential candidates. And if anyone watched the last debate between Senator McCain and Senator, or now President-elect Obama, you know that autism was the only medical condition that was referenced in that debate. And a lot of that had to do with the grassroots efforts and helping to educate the candidates about this very significant public health care issue. And I'm going to get to my last slide here, and then we'll open it up for questions. And that is, we have a lot of awareness initiatives. We have, as I mentioned, our Ad Council Odds campaign that has appeared in print and TV and a number of other areas. We have the World Autism Awareness Day with the UN, or WAD as we call it. There have been extensive media appearances. There have been people on Oprah and The View and a number, Larry King, you name it. Autism is really everywhere these days. And we've also done a number of corporate partnerships with some of the leading organizations and corporations across the world to help raise awareness for autism. So I think I have now gotten to the end. Yep. And I just, in summary and recap, and feel free to ask any questions. I think you have to type them in. But I appreciate you hanging in there with me for the last 40 or 45 minutes. I think autism is something that has really changed significantly over the last 2 decades. It is now what AIDS was in the 80s and what breast cancer probably was in the 90s. And we have made a lot of those strides because parents have really cared a lot and wanted to make a big difference. And I suspect that many, if not most of you who are watching this are probably families that are affected. And I hope you share some of the same kinds of feelings and thoughts about the community. I'm happy to answer whatever questions you might have, but thank you for being there and spending your Sunday night and foregoing the Golden Globes and being here to listen to what I have to say. So looks like there's a question here, and let me see what I can do. This is from, I won't say the names, but what specific interventions have you personally used for your son? What has worked and what has not? Well, if I were to put a slide up of all the interventions that we have used, it would take the majority of the page. You know, there have been interventions that have worked, there have been some that have not, and there have been some that actually have, I wouldn't say caused harm, but, you know, certainly we've had some negative or adverse reactions to. Hard to really summarize, but, you know, from a behavioral standpoint, we, for the most part, have been strong advocates of applied behavioral analysis, or ABA. However, we, over the years, did incorporate some of the best elements of other types of program, whether it's pivotal response or floor time or RDI. You know, these are all different kinds of behavioral interventions. But I wouldn't say that behaviorally we have a program that is specific to any one type of school of thought, so to speak, but we've just incorporated what we felt is the most useful and relevant for Tyler. Biomedically, we have used a number of different things from you know, traditional pharmaceutical products to some of the more biomedical or natural alternative types of things. Again, it would be very difficult to go through the entire history of it, but I can tell you right now, and I talked about kind of the second regression that Tyler went through 2 years ago. The two things that he's currently on that are making a big difference in his life are folic acid, or actually it's not folic acid, and don't I shouldn't say that. It's actually a form of folate, which is part of the pathway of the folic acid. And he's also actually on a Parkinson's drug because he's got a deficiency of dopamine in his cerebral spinal fluid. So again, I could go into a whole lot of depth on that, but you know, some of those things are not traditional and something that you would use typically with children with autism, but in this case, it's worked very well. I'm getting a question here. Will the slides be available after the presentation? You know, that's a good question. I don't know. I'll have to talk with, I guess, Bensi and see if the slides can be made available to you. But if you'd like, I'm going to type in my email address, and if anybody would like to send me an email, and I'll be happy to send you them. So just send me an email if you want the slides, and I'll send it to you directly. Okay, any other questions? Have I tried B12 shots? Yes, we have. And I'd say we tried it for a couple of months. Not terribly fun to give shots in your child's butt. And unfortunately, Tyler was not a big fan of that. Tyler does actually take B12 sublingually, so he takes the powdered form of it and he takes it under his tongue once a day. But we did try the B12 shots. We didn't notice much of a difference, and we felt that it was not worthwhile to continue to try to give him the shots in his rear end every night for that. So, okay, I'm getting another question here. Autism Speaks was not very supportive of biomedical or alternative supplements. Now it looks like they have changed it's it would be hard to say that Autism Speaks was not very supportive. I think that Autism Speaks has evolved. As you know, it's a relatively young organization, and they first merged with NAR, the National Alliance for Autism Research. NAR historically had not had as much experience doing treatment-related research. That was an area that I think CAN was probably a little bit more advanced on. And you know, as those organizations merged together and we started to take and blend the two different science programs, you know, we eventually developed and created a more specific treatment-related program. And one of the things that we felt was important at that time, because treatment has evolved over the years, is that we had to differentiate treatments from the more traditional types to those that are considered to be more alternative. And we know that a lot of these alternative treatments are being used in the community, and it's very important that we understand whether or not they're effective and they're safe and so forth. So, you know, I think it would be unfair to say that Autism Speaks didn't believe in these alternative treatments, but rather that we, as we have evolved, we recognize the importance of looking at these. My friend Terry Steinberg from Chicago, I'm thrilled to hear you are getting into housing, vocational, and more self-determined lives. Can you tell us more about that? Well, what I can tell you is that you know, we all know about the need, I think, and that is, you know, we have a generation of children who are becoming adults, and we recognize that it's important. Here, excuse me, I'm getting Tyler coming home from a church youth group here this evening. So anyway, looking at some of the adult issues, we recognize that, you know, the need's going to be there. We know that there are a number of people that are doing this across the country, but they're being done in pockets, and unfortunately not many people know which are considered to be the best models. I think the thing that's important for us to recognize is that autism is a really heterogeneous disorder, and as a result, the needs are going to be very different. And so, you know, as you get more involved in some of these different areas, you realize that it's kind of like research in that there are different schools of thought. There are some people who believe very much in supported living and basically individuals being able to make their own decisions, to live on their own, and to have the kinds of support that allow them to do that. However, that may not be for everyone. And I think it's important that we have a nice, diverse collection of opportunities and options for our families and those that are affected. And so one of the things we really need to do is to really, you know, do an inventory and understand what's out there and be able to help families understand what's available so that they can make the most informed decisions. I also think that our adult community has suffered from low standards and low expectations, and I think it's you know, become abundantly clear that our children are far more capable of doing things and being successful and having meaningful lives than perhaps some people had believed historically. And so we really need to change the paradigm for what the futures hold. And so I see adult services being kind of like where we were 10 or 15 years ago in terms of research. It's a very underdeveloped field, and we're going to have to figure out ways to develop that field quickly and bring more resources to the table so that we can create those futures for our kids as they start becoming adults in the next 5 or 10 years. I'm happy to talk to you offline, Terry, if you want some more detail. Welcome. Any other questions? Thank you all. All right, well, if there's no more questions, I think I'm going to close my thing. And I wish you all a great night. Yep. Okay.